Good morning, my name is Gillian Askew. That might be a name that's really familiar to you by now. I work for an organisation called Go for Growth, and we are supporting North Yorkshire County Council in the approved provider list procurement for adult social care. You might have joined me in a one-to-one session, you might have joined me in a drop-in session, a Q&A session that we've been running. It might be that you've come to any of the service-specific webinars that we've been doing or process webinars up to press. But my name is Gillian, and the session today is a brief overview designed to help understand the application, the quality section in more detail, and how to structure our answers when we are seeking to submit an application. I'm a provider to the public sector, so these are things that I am really familiar with as a provider. I'm also familiar with them as a procurement practitioner and an evaluator as well. And we're talking about common pitfalls. It is worth noting that the procurement process that we're going through won't necessarily be familiar to every provider. It won't be something necessarily that you're doing often or regularly. You might not have even done this on a digital platform ever before, or if you have, it might have been years and years before. So these common pitfalls are not necessarily any fault of our own that we fall into these traps as providers. It's just a part and parcel of the process, but therefore it's worth probably trying to cover them off just to help us avoid any common pitfalls if we can as providers. And the first, that not answering the question, feels super self-explanatory. We must be answering the question. But often that can be a bit more challenging than it first might seem. And on the next slide, I'm really going to talk in a bit more detail about how to structure your answer in relation to the question and how to break down the question so you really know what it is that the authority are asking of you. But really what I'm talking about here is reading the question in conjunction with the specification and not falling foul of answering what we think the authority might want. If we're ever unsure what the question is asking us, we can always use a clarification question whilst the clarification process is open. And in this case, what North Yorkshire have said is, if there is a question that would prevent you from submitting your application, please do ask it. Or we can fall foul of answering really what we want to say, telling the story that we want to tell that may or may not be directly related to the question that's being asked. But I will leave that for a second because we'll talk more about answering the question on the next slide. Not submitting all the documentation required. We have been asked a number of times by providers, how do we know what we need to upload with our application? What are the additional documents? And on page 4 of volume 5 in the application form, there is a document checklist. So you can see what you have to submit when you are uploading your application for the approved provider lists. But often not submitting all the documentation can manifest itself in two ways. So the question might ask for something specific. So it might ask, for example, a risk register, or perhaps you're just providing some narrative with no particular plan. Or they're asking for something specific in terms of those documents that must be uploaded as part of the application in order to be able to proceed. So do make sure that if there is something in the question that is asking for a document, or always make sure that you check the document checklist and that you have uploaded everything that you've been asked for. No more than you've been asked for, but everything that you've been asked for. And we talk about caveating, so bids with caveats in them, usually related to price, are really difficult for an evaluator to deal with. So try to avoid using caveats, especially where you are pricing things, but even around what you can or can't do. If you're caveating too heavily, it will put the contracting authority in a really awkward position. If you're having to use caveats, that would generally suggest that you have a question that you need to ask. And so our advice would be, if you think you would have to caveat something, perhaps ask a clarification question to avoid needing to caveat in your application. Make sure you ask that clarification question while the clarification process is still available. And again, specification match feels really obvious, but one of the first things I do as a provider, we all find our own way of approaching these processes, but the first thing I do is read the specification and I tick off physically the things that my service that I'm delivering would match. You won't necessarily need to match 100% of what's required, but you will need to be confident that your requirements, your service does match sufficient of the specification in order to be able to submit a confident application. So do make sure that your proposal relates to the requirements in the specification. And we're a big fan in Go for Growth of reusing information that will stand you in good stead in a process and will help minimise the additional work that an application process or a tender or a bid competition would give any provider. We know that we're all really busy. But that does come with some conditions attached to it almost. There's some really great benefits to be had for using and reusing information, but do make sure that you have assessed the relevance and relativity of that information that you're reusing, and that there are no other references to previous applications or other clients, etc., etc. Make sure that it's proportionate, it's relative, and it is aligned with the application that you're currently submitting. And again, we'll talk a little bit about evidence in the next slide, but most questions will be looking for some form of evidence. And so a lack of evidence can be detrimental to the score that you may engender. And even if you haven't been specifically asked for evidence, it can often be useful, depending on if you're allowed to submit attachments and the word count allows, but it can often be useful to back up what you're writing with some evidence of that. It can often strengthen your submission. What you're really trying to do is support the statements that you're making. And again, key information missing, again, feels really obvious, but often it can, when you're working on an application, you can almost go word blind a little bit. And so it's worth having a note of what the key information is that you are trying to include, and make sure that you get all of that key information in there. Don't use irrelevant or superfluous information. Don't waffle in your responses, but do make sure that you capture and include any key information. If it's missing, that was likely to have an impact on your score. Do be aware of the word and page counts that are available to you. And I'll talk again about word and page count in a second, but usually I would come at this from a perspective of don't go over the word or page count. However, what I'm also talking about is do use the word and page count that's available to you. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a second. In terms of the word and page count limit and not going over it, that's really important. It just won't be read or evaluated. It won't be permitted. And in some cases, it will be what's called redacted. So those details won't even make it potentially to an evaluator. So be aware of the word and page count, the format, the font that you are asked to submit things in. And don't make assumptions that the person evaluating will be a technical expert, for example. So the use of acronyms can often be dangerous. If it's not a technical expert who knows what the acronym means, then actually that could be difficult for them to interpret what you're trying to tell them. And often acronyms have dual meanings. For example, SME, SME, could stand for small to medium enterprise, but equally it could be subject matter expert. So don't make assumptions that the evaluator will know what you mean by an acronym. Equally, don't assume that the evaluator will be able to take into account any prior knowledge of you, any relationship that you might have. If you're a current provider to any authority, that can't be taken into account. They're simply not allowed. All that can be taken into account in an evaluation is what you write down. So if you don't write it down, even if you do it, it can't be scored and therefore could go against you. So don't assume that simply because you have a current relationship or you are known to the authority to which you're applying, that those things can be taken into account. They absolutely can't. And then finally on this slide, for the selection questionnaire compliance, so SQ stands for selection questionnaire, and there is something called SSQ, which is standard selection questionnaire. These are questions that every authority will ask you, and they will ask probably the same questions throughout any type of application or competition. Failing to understand them or failing to meet those compliance requirements can often mean that you can't go any further in a process. So it is worth, and you can get the standard selection questionnaire from gov.uk, and it's worth sometimes working through that standard selection questionnaire to work out whether you can comply with all of it in slower time so that you're ready for a process, versus if there are things that you need to work on or you need to go and get, that you can do so in slower time outside of an application process closing date. And so I just wanted to come back to a couple of those things that I talked about in terms of answering the question and using word count. So these are some real questions in the approved provider list in part 4. And you can see at the top that it says that bidders are required to achieve a minimum of 30 points. That's 60% across all scored questions, of which I've only picked out 3. So this is not an exhaustive list. But you must score 60% to be accepted onto the approved provider list. And if you don't score 60%, then actually you won't be allowed at this point to join the approved provider list. And so what I've done is I've highlighted the bits that I think are important. And what I'm going to try to do is spend a couple of minutes talking through how to break down a question and how to work out how to structure your answer. So if we take that first question, care plans, the question is, how do you ensure care plans are individually tailored and person-centred and meet the needs and outcomes of the person? Within your answer, please state how you ensure care plans are kept up to date, what measures you have in place to ensure people are involved in their care planning, and how you link with partners to ensure needs are met. There's a maximum word count of 600 words, and it's evaluated, it is scored, and it has a 25% weighting. So the first thing I would always advise is look for the doing elements of a question. And I think there are 6 particular elements in this question for care plans that you can pull out. So the first 3 are in the first sentence. So how do you ensure care plans are 1, individually tailored, 2, person-centred, and 3, meet the needs and outcomes of the person. So there are 3 distinct things that the authority are looking for. And then in the second sentence, there are a further 3 things I think that the authority are looking for. So within your answer, please, 1, state how you ensure care plans are kept up to date. 2, what measures you have in place to ensure people are involved in their care planning. And 3, how you link with partners to ensure needs are met. So for that first question on care plans, there are 6 individual bits that I think the authority are looking for that you will need to cater your answer against. So you will need to put words in your answer to answer those 6 elements. So that are 1, individually tailored care plans, 2, person-centred care plans, and 3, how you meet the needs and outcomes of the person within that care plan. 4, how you keep your care plans up to date. 5, how you measure the measures that you have in place to ensure people are involved in their care planning. And 6, how you link with partners to ensure needs are met. And that question gives you 600 words to answer those 6 elements. And they don't need to be split 100 words per element or anything like that. But if you make sure that you are ticking off each of those 6 parts of that question across the 600 words, then actually that's going to probably be a really good approach to take. It means that you know that you have answered the core parts of that question. For me, the way to interpret the 600 words are, of course, we can't go over that. That is a maximum word count. And what I said earlier in terms of no waffle, no superfluous words, don't ramble if you don't need to. But this has a 25% weighting. It's a big weighting. If you look at all the weightings across the questions, it will tell you whether that's largest or smallest. But in these 3, at least, it is the single biggest weighting and single biggest word count. Use the words that are there. Make sure that you are giving enough detail to take the evaluator on a journey, that you're actually telling evaluators and evidencing where you can how you ensure care plans are individually tailored, person-centred, and meet the needs and outcomes of persons who have the care plan. If you can do those, you'll probably use all or most of the 600 words. So, for example, if you had a 1-sentence answer to that question, or 10 bullet points, for example, where you've got 600 words, if you're down at 100, 200 words, that is unlikely to attract you the maximum score available, purely because you won't have covered the detail that the authority is looking for. In that second question, involvement and information, again, there are 3 core parts to that question that I can see. So how do you seek feedback about the service might be improved and evidence that the feedback is acted upon is the whole question. For me, how do you seek feedback? How do you show that that's about improving the service, and how do you evidence that the feedback is acted upon? So those are the three core elements of that question for me. So we're looking for 200 words on the process of seeking feedback, how that's aligned with making improvements, and evidence that improvements have been made or that feedback is at least acted upon. And that has a weighted score of 15% and a 200 word count. And again, if you're putting a one sentence answer on there and not using those 200 words, and certainly if you're not addressing those three core parts of that question, it will be unlikely that you'll be gaining the maximum scores. It might even be unlikely that you will make the minimum threshold in order to be invited to join the approved provider list. And that final one is for information only, so it's not scored. However, involvement in information, again, it does have a word count of 100 words. And the whole question is, how do people you support participate in the local community, and how do others get involved with your service? There is a maximum word count of 100 words. And again, I think there's a couple of points that people are looking for on this particular question. And that for me would be, how do people you support, one, participate in the local community, and two, how do others get involved in your service? So even though it's not scored, in order to answer those two core parts of that question, you will be using almost of 100 words for sure, or thereabouts. But even if you're not using the full 100 words, make sure that you have answered those two core parts of the question. If you've been around the approved provider list for a while, you will know that there is support from Go for Growth all the way through this process. So just so that you know, we have a drop-in session this Friday, the 5th of August at 10 a.m. I think it's at 2 p.m. actually, not at 10 a.m., 2 p.m. The Eventbrite link is there. Please do register to come along if you have any questions. As always, we will take process questions. So we can talk about how to break down a question. We can talk about approaching, structuring an answer. What we can't talk about is technical service delivery or pricing related things, but please do come along and chat to us should you want to. We've had over 60 one-to-one meetings with providers throughout this process, so please do feel free to book a one-to-one with either myself or Lauren. You can book those. They're a Teams meeting. If you don't use Teams or you are not a digital user, our contact details are on the next slide, so feel free to email or give us a call. And we have lots of video tutorials and guides available to you. So I've popped a link to our YouTube channel on there also, so you can have a look around and see what's there. Hopefully there'll be some things of use for you. And finally, here are our contact details. So there's mine and Lauren's email address and phone numbers on the slide. You can go to any of our social media channels also, and the Go for Growth programme, which has got lots of content and support development in there for you, not just for this procurement, but for any application process or public sector process that you might be going through. Please do feel free to use those at your leisure. And do get in touch if we can be of any further help or guidance at all. Hopefully that session has been a bit of use. Please do get in touch if we can help you further.